Science fiction's greatest job and greatest trick has been to influence the future, to inspire futures, or to warn people about futures. Some of the fiction I write is activist, which doesn't mean that it's not also driven by this aesthetic desire to make the best story I can. The way the law stands now is if you have a product that has a copyrighted work inside of it, anything with software, it ceases to be your property. It becomes something that you are a tenant of. We are one RFID sensor away from dishwashers that reject third-party dishes. We are one machine vision system away from a toaster that rejects unauthorized bread. You should be able to always tell your computer what to do, not anyone else. Not the police, not the government, not a corporation. When you start writing, it's almost always because you're inspired. But you're not going to be inspired most of the time. Now, what's the realistic plan? If you can't write every day at the number of words that you've been planning to write fewer words and still write every day.
My guest today is Cory Doctorow, the Canadian-British blogger, journalist, science fiction author, and internet activist. You've written over 15 books from nonfiction to award-winning fiction, including the New York Times bestseller Little Brother, as well as Information Doesn't Want to Be Free and Homeland. You are the co-editor of the popular blog Boing Boing, and you're a columnist for The Guardian and Information Week. You've been named one of the web's top influencers by Forbes magazine, and your next novel, Walk Away, is expected April 2017. Cory, welcome to London Real.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
Political-wise, what's it been like being there to watch all this happen? Of course, we haven't really seen anything like this before. Your quick take on what you've seen and what might happen.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The real question, I think, is to what extent are people supporting Trump out of a tribal identity or out of the fact that they dislike Hillary, which is a position I'm not entirely unsympathetic with, although I probably dislike her for different reasons to them. But I'm not fond of her coziness to the finance industry, and I think she's kind of a warmonger, but I don't think that she's literally the devil, as Alex Jones said recently. But to what extent they're supporting Trump for that, and to what extent is it a plebiscite on Republican identity or anti-Hillary sentiment, or are we having a plebiscite seemingly on white supremacy? And that's a question that's like really hard to answer. And to the extent that I'm able to look at it with fresh eyes, it's because I have to explain it to an 8-year-old, our daughter. And for her, it's a very easy set of decisions, right? So first of all, there's the guy who wants to deport immigrants, and she's an immigrant. And he doesn't like refugees, and my dad's a refugee. And he doesn't like brown people, and she likes brown people. And so all of those make it really easy. And then Hillary's a woman and she's a girl and she really wants to see a woman be president. And so for her, it's a relatively straightforward decision. But then she's like, why do Trump supporters support Trump? And that's a tough one. The other interesting thing has been she keeps asserting confidently that Hillary is going to win because no one she knows supports Trump. And I have to keep explaining like self-sorting and homophily, which is where people who are similar tend to hang out with one another, and selection bias. It's kind of been a good way to talk about statistical literacy, but she remains very convinced that she has an accurate sample of America in her middle-class Burbank public school, state school, which I think when she gets older, it will be really interesting to discuss that with her because I think it's making quite an impression on her.
And when we look back in 5 years, will we be able to explain the Trump phenomenon? We'll be able to point and say the nation was feeling this and they panicked and they did this, because I don't believe that America is a nation of white supremacists and all these other things, but maybe I am hanging out with the wrong people. I don't know.
Well, maybe we'll take a break from digging through the rubble with our long poles looking for canned goods to speculate on the causes of the downfall.
Couldn't be that bad, huh?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that Trump is pretty clearly, but in a way that's difficult to articulate, connected to instability in lots of places. And I had a really interesting discussion about what has, in this election, we've started to call the Overton window. It's this old political science term of those things that are legitimate to talk about in politics. Brexit obviously was not within the Overton window, and then it was, and now anti-migrant sentiment has moved into the Overton window. But also, so too has some being pro-gay marriage, and lots of other things have moved in and out of the Overton window. And I met this woman who was an activist from the Middle East. She'd been #1 on Gaddafi's kill list. She lives in Canada now. And we were talking about the Arab Spring and the election of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who are a reactionary party of people whose political ideals are lacking in many ways, but who were also legitimately elected by a significant majority and also deposed through an act of lawless military coup. And I said, when I look at what happened in Egypt, the only explanation I can find for that vote for the Muslim Brotherhood is that for a long time, the Overton window in Egypt did not include the extremely obvious fact that their crappy dictator got tons of money and guns from America because he was friendly to Israel. Even though that was completely obvious to everybody on the ground and everywhere else in the entire world, the official party line of all the mainstream political parties was, we support Mubarak because he's amazing at his job, even though he was manifestly terrible at his job. And that if the only people who say a thing that everyone knows is true and is moreover central to every fact of your life, and especially all the things that makes your life hard, is this one fringe group, it's a bit like Douglas Adams with the towel for hitchhikers. If you've got a towel, they assume that you've got everything else, that you've got a toothbrush and a change of underwear and so on. If you've got the one belief everyone knows is true, it gives all of your other beliefs credibility. And I think that if you look at the populist movements that nevertheless had lots of things that were lacking in them, that were triumphant or are on track to become triumphant, Brexit being one of them, but also the right-wing movements in Greece and Spain, that they do say some things that are true that no one in the mainstream of politics says, right? Like Trump says elections are, or politics are governed by money, and that the fact that politicians need to spend in the US Congress 4 hours out of every 8 they spend on the job calling millionaires, asking them for more money, influences the kinds of policies that they make, right? Like that is so obviously totally true.
Yeah.
And the fact that no one else in the mainstream, apart from Sanders, who not coincidentally gained a lot of support and nearly took the nomination, is willing to say it, probably accounts for a certain amount of his credibility. And the fact that for all the EU's many beneficial elements, it's also a thing that imposes austerity and is often a creature of the finance industry and has lots of other areas in which it's deficient, like the way that it negotiated ACTA and TTIP. That fact is not a thing that Labour talks about, it's not a thing that Lib Dems talk about, and it's not a thing that the Tories talk about, but it was a thing that Farage talked about. And all of the other things he said about migrants were like just wrong. Like, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And his facts were wrong. The numbers of people, what they do to the economy, how they affect our benefits and how they affect our services, they were just factually wrong. But he said one thing that was factually right, that was really like salient to the daily lives of Britons and that everyone else denied. And I think it gave him some credibility. And I think we have these undeniable contradictions in our world today that have a lot to do with income inequality, with the primacy of finance, with the cult of fiduciary duty that says that if you can make £1,000,001 polluting and get fined £1,000,000 for having done it, you have a duty to your shareholders to do it so that you can disperse the one surplus pound to them. All of these things, I think, are contradictions that are intrinsically destabilizing. The concentration of political power in the hands of petro companies that are able to deny climate change. These things are salient and they're not going anywhere and they're headed for rupture. And one of the things that all of these populist movements have in common, the ones I support and the ones I oppose, is that they have at least one thing that they talk about that's outside of the realm of our normal political discourse and that everyone can see at a glance has to be true. And then all the other things they say take on credibility. And I think that in 5 years, when we look back on Trumpism, we will be mired in more of these weird manifestations. California's got this weird direct democracy thing, where if you have enough people who nominate a political issue to be on a ballot, then in the elections, the whole populace votes up or down on these ballot initiatives that take on the force of law and can't be repealed without a countervailing ballot initiative. And in California, there have been a bunch of ballot initiatives. There's ballot initiatives that limit how much the state can tax and also how much it can borrow and require it to spend a certain amount on education, roads, and so on. And the numbers don't add up. They are required by law to spend more than they can take in or borrow. And having been trapped in this contradiction, they take all of the things that are not mandatory, that are discretionary, and treat them in the most completely bizarre way possible to try and shore up this untenable system. So parking tickets in LA are crazily high, because it's one of the few things where the government can levy a fine without having to have a plebiscite on whether or not the fine can pass muster. And when you are required to spend a certain amount of money every month, and you're also required not to take in that amount of money every month or borrow it, you have to find it somewhere. Every loan shark has figured out that if you break someone's knees, they'll find you the money. We have figured out a way to find the money in LA, and it's crazy parking tickets. Where we have these contradictions in our society that are urgent and salient and cannot be resolved in our normal political discourse, abnormal things will happen. And all of those contradictions are only going to get more urgent over the next 5 years. And they're interrelated. Why do we have climate denial? Because power is concentrated in the form of money in a few hands of people who benefit from climate denial. And the costs of climate denial are diffused among many people. And so as a political force, the concentrated wealth of climate denial can outspend the diffused costs of climate change in the hands of the many. And so we will always have crazy climate policy until those facts change. Why does the European Union, when it created its privacy directive, why did they create this category of data called de-identified data that is basically, you have to treat data in the European Union with an enormous amount of care unless you de-identify it so that the people in the data set allegedly can't be identified, which is a thing every computer scientist who doesn't work for a surveillance company thinks is totally impossible. But they created this category and they said effectively, take industry best steps to de-identify your data, and you can treat it as though it has nothing compromising in it. Fold it, spindle it, mutilate it, sell it on, violate your terms of service, treat it as though it has no salience to the lives of the people from whom it was collected. The reason is that the costs of privacy breaches are widely borne and diffused, and they're small in the individual case. Sometimes they're big. But the benefits are hugely concentrated into these billion-dollar empires. We'll never get good policy. So 5 years from now, if we're not digging through the rubble, we will be shaking our heads and going, what are we going to do about these irreconcilable contradictions that have manifested themselves, and that with our political system having concentrated benefits in the hands of the people who benefit from us not acknowledging these contradictions, won't allow us to talk about it. We will be having more weird politics.
So in a way, it's good that Trump is actually getting us to talk about this campaign financing.
Yeah, maybe, if he is.
And so what you do pretty much across the board is point out these discrepancies like you just described to me now in the last 5 minutes of policy, perception, economics, and then all the twisted ways they distribute it out, and all the massive injustices that happen on the tail end, sometimes 10 years later, 20 years later.
Yeah, I feel like on the best days, I feel like we inhabit a moment of peak indifference, where although most people don't know about these issues well enough to care about them, the number of people who care about them only goes up from here. And so to use a very Canadian metaphor, I want to skate to where the puck is going to be. So I feel like our major risk here is nihilism. That, like, as with climate, it's getting to a point now where there are people who are saying, well, the climate's going to change no matter what. We've already put all the carbon into the atmosphere. We might as well eat the last pandas while they're still around, because someone's going to eat them, and get a boat, as opposed to like doing something.
So they're just acquiescing.
Yeah, it's nihilism, right? Nihilism, if you're British.
Yeah. What's the point in worrying about it? What's the point in...
Yeah, if it's a foregone conclusion. And so I feel like all of these contradictions do have solutions. Like, they are tractable, and moreover, that they can only be solved through collective action. No one's going to solve climate change by recycling. We're going to solve climate change by coming up with big globe-spanning accords that have us all working in cooperation. We're not going to get renewables that work unless we can forge deals between the places where the tides are high and the sun shines and the places where they aren't. And given that we only have one atmosphere between all of those countries, whether or not the sun shines there, whether or not the tides are high, we do have to have those agreements, because if we leave out the places where the sun isn't shining, where the tide isn't high, then they will pollute the rest of us to death. And so we are going to have to figure out a deal, and we can do it. We've done big projects before. We solved ozone depletion. We can handle challenges like this. A great British science writer, Oliver Morton, wrote a great book last year on the pluses and minuses of geoengineering and where it's going to go, and how we could do small-scale geoengineering that wouldn't destroy the planet if we got it wrong, and how that's going to require global cooperation. And I think he's right. I think that that's our future. And we can get there if we all work towards it, but we can only all work towards it if we don't all believe that it's a foregone conclusion that everything is going to melt, and therefore we might as well just not even try. Might as well enjoy ourselves while we can.
How do you get people's attention then when it comes to that? How do you snap them out of that nihilism?
Well, fiction is a useful tool for it. Science fiction in particular, like Heinlein said, the three modes of science fiction are what if only, and if this goes on. And you have Orwell and you have Shelley, and right from the earliest days of the genre when it was trying to figure out what it was about, you have writers who were trying to do something explanatory or to make a warning or to inspire. And there's this story science fiction readers and writers sometimes tell themselves that science fiction is a predictive literature. Science fiction makes a lot of predictions. And science fiction's greatest job and greatest trick over the years has been to influence the future, to inspire futures, or to warn people about futures. Gene Roddenberry didn't predict that Motorola's engineers would design flip phones that looked like Star Trek communicators. That would be pretty boring. What's super exciting is he turned a whole generation of telecoms and hardware engineers into ravening Star Trek fans who wanted to do everything they could to build Star Trek communicators. That's way cooler than predicting it. Predicting is fortune telling. Inspiring is way more interesting.
Which is what he did.
Which is, yeah, what he did. And so the thing that fiction can do is it can provide a kind of emotional fly-through of technological change or of a social change. So writers aren't making accurate models of the world as they will be in the future. It's more like a diagnostic exercise. Like when you go to the doctor with a sore throat, she takes a swab off the back of it, she rubs it in a petri dish and leaves it for the weekend, and she comes and she looks at it under a microscope on Monday and can tell you something important about what's going on inside of you. But she isn't doing that because the petri dish reflects accurately how your body works. It's because it's inaccurate in a really useful way. One salient fact about your body is the whole world in the petri dish. And what a science fiction writer can do is pluck a single technology or social factor out of the world and spin up a world in a bottle where that one fact becomes the overwhelming fact. Writers take this one thing, they expand it to take over the whole world, to give you a sense of what that world might feel like, to give you a way of interrogating how that technology or that social change might affect all the different pieces in your life. So imagine it was like 47 and the peace dividend was on us, the war was over, we don't have to spend money on bombing things or figuring out how to dig out rubble anymore, and we're trying to figure out what to do. And someone comes along and says, I have this amazing idea. We have these new TV cameras that we developed in the war, we have new screens and wireless technologies we developed in the war. We'll put a camera in every sitting room, in every corridor, on every corner, and we'll be like men as gods. We will see everything. No sin will go undetected and therefore unpunished. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, God's eye is on the sparrow. Our eye will be on the sparrow. We will be divine in our ability to see all that happens in the world. At the time, all the arguments about why you would want to do that are pretty abstract. Like, it would feel creepy. I can't really tell you why, but that feels wrong to me. But then later in 47, a guy named Eric Blair, writing under his pen name George Orwell, publishes a book called 1984. And like a year after that, we could explain why that was wrong. We could say it would be Orwellian. He gave you the kind of blood and sinew in the argument that's missing when you're talking about it in the pure abstract. And that's an amazing thing to have done. It persisted all the way to the Blair years, where for some reason we decided that 1984 was a manual for statecraft. But up until then, it did a really good job of helping us discuss this. The pilot episode of Yes Minister, or the second episode, season 1, episode 2, is called the Big Brother episode. And it's about a plan to build a database of all of the personally identifying information and potentially compromising facts of everyone in Britain, and how this minister can't possibly defend it because it'd be so ripe for abuse, and in the end the plan collapses. And so this was Yes Minister. This was like really early on. We were using Orwell to talk about how that technological change might happen. That's what we can do to get people to care. It's the thing I can do. It's the one thing I know how to do to get people to care.
Right. And so you saw that when you read a book like that. I guess it's because we understand narratives so well as humans. Like, those click in our brains. And so when he tells us this story and we imagine this world, all of a sudden, like you said, it's Orwellian. Whereas you could explain it ad nauseum without a story behind it, and we can't connect with it.
Without a person behind it. Making your work public is really powerful. It's what gave us the Enlightenment. Before the Enlightenment, we had alchemy. It's a lot like the Enlightenment, except you don't tell other people what you thought you've learned. And so you take shortcuts and you kid yourself that they don't matter. This is how alchemists learned for themselves they shouldn't drink mercury, and why none of them learned it from any of the other ones, because they wouldn't tell each other. And when they started publishing, they started telling each other what they thought they knew and subjecting themselves to adversarial peer review, where your enemies call you an idiot for having made mistakes that your friends have gently pointed out to you. That's when, like, the base metal of alchemy was transformed into the precious metal of science. That's the Enlightenment. So yeah, exposing your workings, it's a powerful thing to do.
I was just thinking of martial arts. So until the UFC came around 20 years ago, everyone had their own martial arts style, but it was a bit like alchemy. Because like, my Taekwondo guy will always win. And they were these little pockets, but they weren't peer reviewed and they weren't tested. UFC comes along and says, let's put everybody in a cage and we'll see what happens. And all of a sudden, everything started getting exposed. And
Hybrid
yet,
vigor.
People also started learning at massive rates and adopting, and now we have probably the best fighters ever in the history of man because of, publicity.
Yeah, because of cross-fertilization, because of hybridization, because and it's the same reason. I'm just reading Tim Harford, who's a London economist. I think he lives in Oxford now, but a British economist, writes on the FT. He's got a new book out called Messy, and I've just been reading it here. And the opening chapters, one of them is about team building and team performance. And the data on team performance is pretty strong on the idea that heterogeneous teams of people who have very different points of view perform better than very homogeneous teams. And that's because, like, the easy way to understand that is when you get to a problem that, if you all have the same point of view, then when you get to a problem that point of view can't handle, all of you are stopped in your tracks. But if you have different points of view, then it's unlikely that you'll all fail at the same point. So each of you will push the group forward in ways that all of you together couldn't if you had the same point of view. And the thing is that hanging out with people you like, who have the same point of view as you, is more fun than hanging out with people you don't like who have really different points of view to you, but it's less effective. And it's kind of a paradox. I'm not a martial artist by any stretch, but I've done a little training in one or two, and they're different. And people, like, the reason there's more than one of them is because people have different needs, and they have different learning styles and different things they're looking for.
Cultures, too.
Cultures, yeah, different physiological limitations. And so they do this instead of that. Tai Chi is not Taekwondo, right? You practice them for really different reasons. And yet, as you see, when you get everyone together, you get better martial arts for everyone. But the subjective experience might not be the same. And so it's this weird paradox. The study that Harford cites is of the very fattish California investor clubs that sprang up during the stock bubble of the 90s. And so they were stock picking clubs. And there were two kinds. There were workplace kinds that were very heterogeneous. And then there were friend kinds that were very homogenous. And the interesting thing about stock clubs is they have a really empirical measure. How do their shares do? And the heterogeneous ones pick better shares. And they pick better shares in part because they didn't mind arguing with each other. Friends don't want to call each other idiots for having dumb ideas about shares. So, we'll go along with Bob. He's got a thin skin and got in trouble at work this week. We don't want to give him a hard time. And Bob has picked pets.com to push all the money into, and then you're all broke, right?
That's a weird point.
Yeah.
Talk to me about MIT and the Media Lab. You have a role there now. When I graduated in '93, I don't think there was a Media Lab, or it was
brand new,
maybe brand new.
Existed. Yeah.
Also, the internet didn't really exist when I graduated, and like an email was just starting to get used.
Right.
It's weird to think of MIT without the internet, but in a weird way, it's also not weird because there's so much pure science there. What's it like to be associated with the Media Lab, and what's your role there?
Yeah, I had this really interesting role, and the Media Lab is not the Media Lab that it was under Nicholas Negroponte, its inaugural director. Its new director, Joey Ito, is a very old friend of mine, and Joey is a polymath and also autodidact. He doesn't have an undergraduate degree. I don't know if he ever finished high school. And as someone who spent 7 years in a 4-year high school and then dropped out of 4 undergraduate programs without getting a degree, I feel really empathic with Joey. I feel like we're on the same path here. And he's like entrepreneur. He started the first major ISP in Japan. He is kind of a cultural gadfly. He was Timothy Leary's godson and arranged to have Leary's ashes shot into space. He's an investor, early investor in LinkedIn and in Six to Start, which did movable type and a bunch of other early success stories. And he's politically pretty radical. He was Creative Commons International Director. And when he arrived at the Media Lab, he brought with it this academically and politically radical vision of how the Media Lab would do business. So the Media Lab's motto used to be demo or die, and everyone had to build these demos out that the lab's corporate sponsors would come out and see, and some of them would be commercialized. That's where Lego Mindstorms came from, along with a lot of other super cool technologies like Scratch. And then his became develop or die, and then just became develop. And so it's all about people making stuff fast, iterating quickly, and cross-pollinating. And he and I have very different work styles. I'm a caveman, misanthrope, self-exiling dude. Joey can't live without continuous social interaction with other people. He will give any student office hours, but only, I think it's 10 minutes. And so they have to basically write a TED talk of their problem. And he sits in his office all day and just gets the brightest kids in the world show up and present their ideas in the most intense way, and then he advises them really intensely. He is in hog heaven. He started this project there called the Forbidden Research Project, and its immediate catalyst was what happened to a mutual friend of ours, another entrepreneur and scholar and activist named Aaron Schwartz. He's a very bright young man. I met him when he was 12 years old, and he had been contributing to some of the core internet infrastructure, something called RSS. It's one of the applications of XML, and it's now woven into things like podcasts.
Yeah, iTunes uses
Yeah.
that.
So he was helping to develop RSS, and he was coming to San Francisco for these meetings, these XML meetings. And his parents were understandably nervous about their young teenage son showing up. And my girlfriend at the time, this woman Lisa Ryan, was his great and good friend and mentor and mother figure. And so he would come and stay on her sofa, and we would squire him around town. And we'd introduce him to all the most interesting grown-ups, and he would amaze them with his interestingness. And he went on to help found a company called Reddit that went and did very good things. And then when they were bought out by Condé Nast, he found that he didn't want to be in corporate harness, and he unceremoniously quit by refusing to show up for work. The way his boss found out that he was presenting at a conference in Berlin was when he went over his desk and couldn't find him, and then one of his freelancers filed a story about the presentation he was giving in Berlin that day. And then went on to do amazing scholarly things. So when he was in residence at Stanford, he scraped this huge corpus of law review articles. And what he was looking for was the relationship between funding of law departments by oil companies and law review articles that supported oil companies' arguments about their lack of culpability for climate change. And he wanted to see if there was a connection between these. And so he did...
The Pelican Brief or something, right?
Yeah, well, big data Pelican Brief.
Okay.
Because he did it programmatically. He was a hacker. So he sucked down this huge corpus, and then he used early text mining technology to do this groundbreaking work. And then he became a real advocate for open access. So in the US, court records are not copyrighted or copyrightable, because government works, we don't have crown copyright in the US. Government works belong to the people. But the court documents, which are the law isn't just what Congress writes, it's what the courts interpret. You can't know what the law is without being able to read the judgments and the proceedings. So the court documents are locked up in a system called PACER, which charges 10 cents a page to access it. It was a penny a page and it went up from there. Maybe it was 8 cents a page and went up from there, which is hilarious. How can data retrieval become more expensive as the years go on? But there was a loophole, which is that you could get pages through the library for free. And once you had them, you could do anything you wanted with them because they weren't copyrighted. And so some researchers created a tool called Recap, which would take pages from Pacer and put them in the public domain. And then you had a browser plugin, and if you ever requested a page from Pacer that was already in Recap, it would preferentially go to the free page. Okay. And if you requested a Pacer page that wasn't yet in Recap, it automatically put it there. It's really cool technology. And Aaron and his accomplices got millions of the most widely cited law, millions of pages of the most widely cited law out of Pacer and into Recap by going to libraries. $1 million worth of Pacer liberated and put into the hands of the people who it governed. And the FBI investigated him, and he made fools of them. And then he was at Harvard, down the road from MIT. And he would walk down the road to MIT and use their public network as he was allowed to do. And he would download documents from another scientific repository, JSTOR, which he was also allowed to do. But he violated their terms of service, which said that he could only access them one at a time by hand. He wrote a short computer program, a few lines, to download these articles. So that we don't know why he was downloading them. Some people think he was going to publish them online for free. Some people think he was going to do another thing like his law review research, but maybe about different kinds of climate change, maybe about climate science and the connection to oil company endowments. No one knows.
How old is he at this point?
He was in his mid-20s by then.
Okay.
And so what we do know is that the FBI got involved. MIT swore out a complaint against him. MIT, where they had this tradition of maverick intellectual curiosity and rule breaking, right? There's these things, the MIT hacks, which you must remember from your time there. People build full-scale fire engines on the roof of the dome. They dye the fountains purple. They do all kinds of crazy, amazing things that are called MIT hacks, and they're celebrated. In fact, MIT has a book called Night Work that was published by MIT Press that's an oral history of MIT hacks. It's this incredible book. Yeah. And so Aaron, who was like in the MIT community and was down the road at Harvard and was doing this intellectually curious things, MIT hung him out to dry. They put, even after the people whose data repository Aaron had been scraping said that they had no interest in pursuing a claim against him, MIT kept it up. And Aaron was facing 13 felony counts, 35 years in prison for checking too many books out of the library at MIT. And in the end, he hanged himself. after he was spent into penury, all the money he'd made from Reddit and every dollar he could borrow from his friends, spent in a legal proceeding that was dragged out by the prosecutor until he hanged himself. And Aaron wasn't the only kid who'd ever been hung out to dry by MIT. It was part of an MIT tradition of hanging students out to dry when they broke the rules in ways that went beyond the pale. So MIT had this thing where we've got your back until you cross an invisible line that we'll never articulate, and then we'll throw you to the wolves. So a woman named Star Simpson had been at the MIT Media Lab in the wearable technology group making textiles that were smart. And she had designed a piece of jewelry that had LEDs in it. And she wore it to the airport to pick up a friend to Logan Airport. And she's darkly complected. She's an indigenous Hawaiian, or at least some of her ancestry is indigenous Hawaiian. She had short hair. And someone phoned in a report of an Arab-looking young man with a bomb around his neck. And she was thrown to the ground by a SWAT team that pointed machine guns at her. And the MIT, this was her work. This was her research that she was wearing. It was a little wearable computer. And the MIT counsel's office threw her to the dogs. She never finished her research. Before she'd even been released from her questioning, they'd already done a public statement condemning her. Bunny Huang is an amazing scholar and researcher who did his PhD in electrical engineering at MIT and is now celebrated as one of the world's premier hardware designers and hardware hackers, a great entrepreneur who's deeply involved with people from the West who want to do manufacturing in China, high-quality electronic manufacturing in China. And one of the things he did as part of his research when he was there is he broke the copy protection, the user controls on the original Xbox so that he could install Linux on it. And again, the general counsel there hung him out to dry. So Joey showed up and he said, these are the kinds of researchers that we want at the Media Lab. And he started a project called the Forbidden Research Project. And he tapped Reid Hoffman, who's the founder of LinkedIn, one of the founders of PayPal, to endow a $250,000 cash prize for forbidden research. It's the largest cash prize being offered at MIT right now. And he asked me to help him with it. And so I became MIT's activist in residence. And I draw a small grant that pays for the work I do with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm working with them to help sue the US government to overturn a really crappy law. And our client is Bunny Huang, the guy who was hung out to dry all those years ago by MIT. What goes around comes around. It's pretty amazing.
So this is kind of your effort in reversing this injustices that MIT showed over the years and really changing the course and rewarding students for doing these maverick-like activities.
Yeah, and to make MIT accountable to its best nature. At its best, MIT has encouraged the kind of intellectual curiosity without boundaries that has produced the great success stories of its alumni. And what we want to do is help it be true to that principle, help it navigate that fine line. So one of the things MIT has done in the last couple of years is set up a law clinic for students whose research gets them into potential legal trouble, which also helps young lawyers learn to be better lawyers, better tech lawyers. What is tech law all about if not figuring out how to help nerds whose imaginations have gotten them into trouble with the law to navigate those very difficult waters?
Did Aaron's death affect you?
Yeah, really profoundly. I'd known Aaron for a really long time. He had written the afterword to a novel that came out 2 weeks after he died and had really helped me write that novel. It was the sequel to the Little Brother book called Homeland. And I'd had this placeholder in the book because I wanted the character to come up with an amazing next-generation internet-based electioneering platform that he would help an independent candidate for the California Senate use in a by-election. It was a kind of plot point I wanted it to turn on. And I rang up all the electoral strategists I knew. And I know some super smart electoral strategists who worked on some of the biggest campaigns, the data-driven big campaigns, because they all come out of the same place that I do. .com, Technology, Story. They're good people and they're super smart and imaginative. And I said, if you had a candidate who would go along with your craziest idea, what would your craziest idea be? None of them were crazy enough. They were all inside the Beltway, inside the Overton window, inside the box thinking. And then at my wit's end, I wrote to Aaron and I said, what would you do? And he sent me back shovel-ready ideas. 6 paragraphs that I literally just lightly rewrote and pasted right into the book because it was perfect. And the last line of that email was, I gotta go now, I'm gonna go build this. So he was this amazing guy and a real force of nature. I mean, he wasn't an angel. I disagreed with him now and again, so had lots of other people, but he was an amazing guy and a hero in many ways. And what he faced was so radically unjust. And he was hounded into it by a prosecutor who he'd made a fool of when the prosecutor worked with the FBI to come after him for his PACER work, and who had decided that he was going to score political points. And it was disgusting and awful. And it galvanized us. It galvanized a whole group of people into making sure that the next Aaron would be protected. The inspiration that people have taken from Aaron has been amazing. And I would give anything, I'd give all that inspiration to have him back. But many of us, taken it upon ourselves to make sure that his death wasn't in vain. So the young Russian woman who started scihub.cc, which is taking all the publicly funded science that's been put behind paywalls and making it available for free. She spoke at our Forbidden Research Conference. She said, I'm doing Aaron's work. This is what Aaron wanted to do, and I'm doing it too. We don't know if that's what Aaron wanted to do, but he clearly inspired her to do it. It's an amazing thing.
And that's what you're doing at MIT, basically.
Somewhat, yeah. I'm not doing it just because of Aaron or just for Aaron, but Aaron's never far from our thoughts when we think about this stuff. I work with Aaron's brother Noah at Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I know his dad, and they're all remarkable people, and they all see this as the best thing we can salvage from it. The thing I'm wary of when I talk about how Aaron's death has turned into this inspiration is I don't want people to think that when all else is bleak, that the best thing you can do is commit suicide and be an inspiration to others or a warning to others. Aaron's committing suicide was the stupidest thing he ever did. But Aaron was really good at solving problems, and that was a dumb way to solve his problem. It didn't solve his problem. Like, dead people don't get to act on the world. Only living people solve problems. Dead people are dead. They're inert. And so all of the problems that Aaron had in him to solve in the future will be left unsolved forever because he made a really dumb choice. And anyone who's watching this or listening to this and thinking about this, remember that you cannot solve your problems after you're dead. I think that on computer science we have this idea called hill climbing algorithms, where if you don't know which way to go and you're trying to find the highest point, you can look around and see if there's anything that's a slightly higher point than the one you're in now and take that step. And from there you get a new vantage point from which you might spy another higher point and take the next step. And I always believe that if you don't know how to get to the top, but you can see how to get a little higher, that you should take that step. The first casualty of any battle is the plan of attack. The route you plot from here to your goal is going to be destroyed by exogenous shocks because you don't live in a static universe and you're probably underestimating how much work it's going to be anyway. If you, rather than planning all the way, just try and find what your next step will be, you will always be able to find another step. And if you run out of room and you haven't gotten to where you are, then maybe you found the top of a pitcher's mound instead of a mountain. And maybe you have to go down a couple of steps to find a new way to go up, but it's still a good rule of thumb.
I like that. I'm going to use that, the hill climbing algorithm.
Yeah.
Final one, to that 20-year-old that's listening to us on iTunes, watching us on YouTube, or consumes this however in the future around the world, could be in China, South America, anywhere.
Thought mail.
Yeah. What advice do you give to them? You know, they've listened to us. They're obviously really thinking about a lot of their technologies, the surveillance, some of these huge technology companies. What advice do you give to them if they want to make sure that their future is protected, that they're not going to wake up with that lung cancer of a privacy concern or these other things?
Mm-hmm. The cool thing about computers, the new thing on this earth about computers, is that cryptography works. And cryptography allows us to take computers that are so cheap they're virtually disposable and use them to scramble our private thoughts and messages so thoroughly that if all the hydrogen atoms in the universe were turned into computers and they did nothing between now and the heat death of the universe but try to break that message and find the key, that we run out of universe before we run out of potential keys. But cryptography has generally been used by people who were technical enough to know why they had to worry. And so it was designed, all the privacy tools were originally designed on the assumption that you were already a super nerd if you wanted to use them. So they could be super nerdy in their interface. The same way that before desktop publishing, like all desktop publishing software assumed that you were already a typographer. Because the only people who ever had to lay out a page were already typographers. And much of what's in crypto technology is like typography technology. It can be made comprehensible to normal humans. And there is an increasing practice of making crypto and privacy technology that is aimed at normal humans. The Electronic Frontier Foundation maintains a thing called the Surveillance Self-Defense Kit, which is broken up into playlists for different applications. If you're a queer kid in the closet with intolerant parents, if you're an activist in a repressive regime, if you're a high school student trying to not get bullied, it has different playlists that take you through how to use it. It's translated into 11 languages. It's free. It's open license, so you can reproduce it and adapt it, print it out, sell it, anything you want with it. It's a great place to start that makes all this stuff easier. And if you find any of it harder, keep checking because it's getting easier by the day. I'm on the board of a nonprofit called Simply Secure that's developing free, open, usable interfaces and methodologies for making usable interfaces so that normal humans can use privacy tech.
Okay. Tor browser has been a big thing for that?
Tor browser, GPG,
yeah.
Signal, and other cryptographic communications tools for messaging. I'm on the board of a commercial one called Wicker that is used by a lot of people in industry. They're all super easy to use these days. Tor browser is much easier than Tor used to be even a couple of years ago.
Yeah. Everybody should be familiar with Tor, should pull it up, and then GPG. Like I had Annie Michon on here a few years ago.
I know Annie.
And Annie, she was former MI5 agent, and she used to always send me encrypted emails. And like over and over again, and she's just like, you really should look into this, Brian.
It's getting easier, right?
Yeah,
5 years ago it was a lot harder.
Yeah.
It's so much easier now. There's a thing called keybase.io that's making one of the hardest parts easier. There's big changes afoot in the way that this stuff works.
Yeah, it's important people look at that. Cory, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, it was my pleasure.
Just want to acknowledge you for all the work you've done, for all the work.
Thanks for having me on. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, it was really nice talking to you.
I'm Noah, Aaron's brother. I've been given a little space at the end of this book because I'm a flesh and blood human, and as such, I can tell you some things you wouldn't believe if it came out of the mouth of any of these fictional characters. This stuff is real. Sure, there isn't actually anyone named Marcus or Angie, at least not that I know, but I do know real people just like them. If you want, you can go to San Francisco and meet them, and while you're there, you can play D&D with John Gilmore, or build a rocket ship in Noisebridge, or work with some hippies on an art project for Burning Man. And if some of the more conspiracy-minded stuff in the book seems too wild to be true, well, just Google Blackwater, XE, or Bluecoat. I myself have a FOIA request in to learn more about persona management software, but the feds say it'll take more than 3 years to redact all the relevant documents. Now I hope you had fun staying up all night reading about these things, but the next part is important, so pay attention. What's going on now isn't some reality TV show you can just sit at home and watch. This is your life. This is your country. And if you want to keep it safe, you need to get involved. I know it's easy to feel like you're powerless. Like there's nothing you can do to slow down or stop the system. Like all the calls are made by shadowy and powerful forces far outside your control. I feel that way too sometimes, but it just isn't true. A little over a year ago, a friend called to tell me about an obscure bill he'd heard of called Combating Online Infringement and Counterfeiting Act, or COICA. As I read the bill, I started to get more and more worried. Under its provisions, the government would be allowed to censor websites it didn't like, without so much as a trial. It would be the first time the U.S. government was given the power to censor its citizens' access to the net. The bill had just been introduced a day or two ago, but it already had a couple dozen senators co-sponsoring it. And, despite there never being any debate, it was already scheduled for a vote in just a couple days. Nobody had ever reported on it, and that was just the point. They wanted to rush this thing through before anyone noticed. Luckily, my friend noticed. We stayed up all weekend and launched a website explaining what the bill did, with a petition you could sign opposing it that would look up the phone number of your representatives. We told a few friends about it, and they told a few friends. And within a couple of days, we had over 200,000 people on our petition. It was incredible. Well, the people pushing this bill didn't stop. They spent literally tens of millions of dollars lobbying for it. The head of every major media company flew out to Washington, D.C., and met with the president's chief of staff to politely remind him of the millions of dollars they donated to the presidential campaign, and explain how what they wanted, the only thing they wanted, was for this bill to pass. But the public pressures kept building. To try and throw people off the trail, they kept changing the name of the bill, calling it PIPA or SOPA, and even the E-Parasites Act. But no matter what they called it, more and more people kept telling their friends about it and getting more and more people opposed. Soon, the signers on our petition stretched into the millions. We managed to stall them for over a year through various tactics, but they realized if they waited much longer, they might never get their chance to pass the bill. So they scheduled it for a vote first thing after they got back from winter break. But while members of Congress were off on winter break, holding town halls and public meetings back home, people started visiting them. Across the country, members started getting asked by their constituents why they were supporting this nasty internet censorship bill, and members started getting scared, some going so far as to respond by attacking me. But it wasn't about me anymore. It was never about me. From the beginning, it was about citizens taking things into their own hands, making YouTube videos and writing songs opposing the bill. making graphs showing how much money the bill's co-sponsors had received from the industries pushing it, and organizing boycotts putting pressure on the companies who'd endorsed the bill. And it worked. It took the bill from a political non-issue that was poised to pass unanimously to a toxic football no one wanted to touch. Even the bill's co-sponsors started rushing to issue statements opposing it. Boy, were those media moguls pissed. This is not how the system is supposed to work. A ragtag bunch of kids doesn't stop one of the most powerful forces in Washington just by typing on their laptops. But it did happen, and you can make it happen again. The system is changing. Thanks to the internet, everyday people can learn about and organize around an issue, even if the system is determined to ignore it. Now, maybe we won't win every time. This is real life after all, but we finally have a chance. But it only works if you take part. Now that you've read the book and learned how to do it, you're perfectly suited to make it happen again. That's right. Now it's up to you to change the system.